Welcome everyone to Unit 2, Lesson 1. For our first lesson in Unit 2, we are going to be revisiting something that we've kind of neglected or ignored for the text mining and education course so far. And that is doing some data visualization and graphing using one of the tidyverse packages, ggplot2. So far, we've sort of ignored doing some of this, although we've gotten a little bit of practice with our text mining in R book and also with our R for Data Science book. But now it's really time that we started digging in. So in this lesson, we are going to be working through some examples from Chapter 3 of our R for Data Science book on data visualization. And then also we're going to have some practice exercises through Swirl again. And in these practice exercises, they're going to work you through some examples similar to what we'll experience in our data visualization chapter for the R4 Data Science book. So let's go ahead and get everything we need for this lesson up and running. So we'll be good to go. First, let's begin just by going ahead and loading our tidyverse set of packages. So when we load the tidyverse package, it's actually going to load a number of packages for us, one of those being ggplot2 and another being the dplyr package that we've used in Unit 1 for manipulating data. So let's go ahead and get that package ready. And remember, we can always verify over here in the packages that it has been loaded. There's tidyverse right there. And that also should have set up for us ggplot2. There it is. We won't be using tidy text in this lesson, but we will in Lesson 2. All we're going to concern ourselves with for Lesson 1 of Unit 2 is simply ggplot2. So now that we have that loaded, let's go ahead and also get our swirl exercises ready that we're going to be using for ggplot2 as well. So let's go ahead and call swirl. Oops, getting ahead of myself there. Swirl, there we go. And again, let's go ahead and verify. There it is. Yep, we got that all set up and running. Now we are going to be loading a new course for Swirl called Exploratory Data Analysis, and I have gone ahead and provided the code for you to set this up and get this package going. As you can see, we've already loaded Swirl, so next thing we're going to do now that we have that package ready is we're going to go ahead and install this course. So I'm just going to copy this over here. You can see that hashtag is just a little comment that explains what this line of code is doing. I often do that sometimes just to kind of remind myself of what exactly I was trying to get done in that particular case. So let's go ahead and run this. As you can see, I got a little error there. Something is going wrong here. So let's go ahead and take a look at this line of code. And I think I've already identified the problem. So as you can see, typically when we surround things in quotes, that indicates that that's a string of text. Right now, it's not highlighting that quote right there. So obviously, when we copied, there we go, when we copied this over and simply pasted it in, we had a little issue here. So let's go ahead and fix that. Let's go ahead and there we go. Add some quotes. There we go. Now it's looking right. So let's go ahead and try to run that again. So let's install this course. And once we install the course, we should see progress for the installation. There we go. As you can see, I've already installed this course before, but I'm going to go ahead and overwrite it just so I can start fresh in the course. So let's go ahead and there we go. Oops. There we go. I want to say yes, go ahead and overwrite it. So try this again. There we go. So I've gone ahead and installed that course again. So just to verify, let's go into Swirl and take a look. All right, it's asking for my name. I don't see exploratory data analysis there, so I'm going to go ahead and say let's start something new. And there we go. So now I can see my new course, Exploratory Data Analysis. That's good to go. And we are going to be working on lessons 8 and 9 for our particular lesson. We're not going to go ahead and load that now. We'll do that at the end of this lesson just to illustrate setting that course up and running through a couple exercises. So let's go ahead and pause right there and go back to our text. In Chapter 3, the authors are going to walk us through basically getting up and running with ggplot2. As you can see in the introduction, they've gone ahead and loaded the library tidyverse. You'll notice that when I loaded it, we didn't see all of that text indicating that certain packages were attached, and that's just because I already had these loaded to begin with. So let's go ahead and get started. With ggplot2, we're primarily going to be working with this miles per gallon data frame. This is something that's just built into R as a data set to work with and play around with. This includes information about cars, I think from 2008 and 2012, but don't quote me on that. And it includes information such as manufacturer of the automobile, the model, the year it was, 1999 and 2008. Those are the 2 years. Including information also about whether or not it is automatic or manual transmission, number of cylinders, and then miles per gallon on the highway, average miles per gallon, and then some additional information. This displacement also indicates the size of the engine as well. So let's go ahead and get running with our very first graph using ggplot. So our very first 2 lines of code that we're going to be working with for ggplot2 already give an indication or kind of a sense of how we can begin to start building charts using ggplot by adding kind of layer on top of layer, each with a unique kind of specification for how we want the data to be plotted and what we want it to look like. So in our very first call, our very first function, the actual ggplot function, what we're doing right there is essentially just telling it and specifying what data it is we want to map. So we're calling ggplot, we're specifying the data, and then we're going to add on our very first layer. And essentially every plot that we're going to make in ggplot, we're going to have to specify a little geometric function here, basically what type of graph we want to make. And in this particular case, we are using geonPoint function, and we're basically saying that we would like to create a scatter plot. So this is just one of many charts that we can create in ggplot, obviously. So there are a number of geometric functions within ggplot. And in there we go. In the actual lesson, I included a link to the ggplot cheat sheet, which just describes really briefly the number of different charts that we can create with ggplot. And here's an example of, well, it's not an example, it's the actual cheat sheet itself, where you can see where the number of different geometric functions that we can use to create different charts. So for example, if we're just plotting one variable, we could make a histogram there. We could also do, in our case, we have 2 continuous variables, so we are actually using the geonPoint function to make a scatter plot. And as you can see, there are really quite a number of different charts that we can actually make in ggplot. So just that as an aside, but let's go ahead and go back to our R4 data science text there, and let's get back to these 2 lines of code that we are working with. And each geometric function here, whether it's point or whether we're making a line graph or a bar chart or a column graph, they're each going to have their own specific mapping argument. And in this case, what we're saying is what we want to do for mapping this data onto this particular graph is effectively we're just saying, specifying what variables in our data we want to be along the x-axis and what variables we want to be along the y-axis. So let's go ahead and copy this over and run our very first line of code, creating our very first chart using ggplot. So I've gone ahead and copied this over, but as I can see down here in the console, that I'm still running swirl, so I need to go ahead and exit out of that. There we go. So I've left swirl, and now I'm ready to begin working with ggplot. So let's actually just run this kind of line by line here. So if we just call the function ggplot and we specify the data, but we don't indicate what's going on with respect to how we want it mapped and which variables we want to use for the mapping, nothing's really going to happen. So if we go ahead and run that, we can see that it attempted to make a plot, but it doesn't know what to plot and how to plot it. So again, this geometric function specifying the chart we want to make and the actual mapping that we want to do is essential for creating our first plot. So effectively what we're doing is this is like the bare minimum that we need to get a chart going. So let's go ahead and run this line of code, and we should see something to the effect that duplicated what we saw in the text. As you can see, we've got over here, just as we indicated, on our x-axis, the size of the engine ranging from a 1-point-something liter engine all the way up to a 7-liter engine, which is a pretty sizable engine. Oddly enough, which is kind of interesting, that gets much better gas mileage, highway gas mileage than a number of these vehicles, which is kind of surprising. My guess is I think that might be one of the sports cars, which has a sizable engine, but because it's such a small car in terms of size and weight, it's a little better gas mileage. A couple quick things that I want to show you that's going to come up later in our text and also in the swirl lessons is some kind of interesting, unique aspects of ggplot that will save us some time and coding later down the road and really make the code that we're going to be writing a little bit more efficient. So one thing that's unique about ggplot is if we are going to be using this mapping function, basically saying for all the remaining layers that we want to add to our graph in terms of visual aesthetics, labels, etc., we could actually just move this up here into the ggplot function. So now any sort of layer that we add to it, whether it's a geometric function or statistical transformation or anything like that, it's going to go ahead and know that, that we've already specified the mapping. So if we went ahead and ran this, we're effectively going to be getting the same chart. And also because in R, because we can store code as objects, if we knew that we were going to be using this particular data set in this particular mapping, these two variables on the x and y axis, then we could actually just go ahead and, give me a second here, we could just go ahead and store this as a unique object or variable in R. And we could just call this G, and then we could go ahead and just call up G again, which is effectively this string of code or this line of code right here, and then we can say now everything that's stored up here, basically this line of code, we're just going to reuse again, and then now we're going to say, now we're going to actually specify how we want to plot these things, and we want to make a scatter chart. So let's go ahead and do that. And then we can see that we've, again, reproduced this line of code up here, which is identical to this line of code right here, which in turn is identical to this line of code right there. So again, if we were going to use this over and over again, it would just be handy to just store it as its own unique variable or object in R to just call up whenever we needed it. That takes us through our very first chart in ggplot2. And again, at minimum, what we need to do is specify the data that we want to use, obviously, the chart we want to make, and exactly what variables we want to map onto this chart and how we want to map them. So if you scroll down here, we can see that for chapter 3.2, there are some exercises. I'm going to ask you, just as part of your required readings, that I've kind of walked you through some of this text, but I do highly recommend that you go through as you're working through this and read it on your own, because there's a lot of information shared here that's critical that I'm just not covering in this video. So next we're going to move on to aesthetic mappings. So at this point, this is this AES argument right here. And so far, the only aesthetics that we have indicated that we want to go on our chart is effectively where we want the which variables we want to use and on which axes. But we can also go ahead and specify a number of other things as well. So, excuse me, for example, we can also specify these points on our chart. We could specify colors that we want them to be. We could also specify the shape of these things on the chart. So let's go ahead and work through another example really quickly of adding an additional argument to our static function that we've included for ggplot2. So let's go ahead and copy this over. Again, if you were working through this yourself, I'm doing copy and paste just for efficiency and to make the somewhat long videos a little bit less long. But if I were you, I would actually just be going through these videos and retyping each line of code just so you can get a feel for it, and also to recognize that when you make mistakes with basic typos, you can get a better sense of where those mistakes are made and why you made them. So again, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this over. Let's talk through this line of code. I'm just going to create a little line here just for clarity as I'm reading. So let's see. Again, we've got, this is nothing new. We indicated that last time. We're specifying that this is a scatter plot that we're making, and we're mapping the aesthetics onto this chart. We've already, there we go. I'm just going to call this out a little bit more clearly. We've already specified the x-axis and the y-axis, but now we want to add some color to our chart. So in this case, what we're doing is mapping class, so the class of the vehicle, onto the color for the points, for the points in our scatter plot. And in this case, class indicates what type of vehicle it is, whether it's an SUV or a compact, midsize, etc. So let's go ahead and run this line of code as well. And I'm going to go ahead and run that. And then we can see over here, let's go ahead and refresh this chart. There we go. And we can see that SUVs, unsurprisingly, typically have poor miles per gallon on the highway, less fuel efficient, and some of our most efficient cars, also unsurprisingly, are subcompact cars. So that's what it looks like when we expand some of the aesthetics for this chart. So we're mapping our engine displacement, size of our engine onto the x-axis. We're mapping the miles per gallon on the highway onto the y-axis. And then we're also indicating, we're mapping the class of the vehicle to indicate what color we'd like it to be. So that's kind of aesthetic mappings in a nutshell. In this case, they're going to run you through some more examples in the text. Again, I'm not going to run you through all of these, but in this case, if we wanted to just explicitly specify the color of the chart, we could just say, let's make all points on the graph blue. In this case, they added the color aesthetic and just indicated blue here in quotes. Again, for the aesthetic mappings, there's some exercises that I highly recommend that you work through. So for example, in this case, we can see that for some reason, when we specify the color as blue, it is not showing up as blue on the chart. Why might that be the case? So 3.4, obviously, you're going to come across some problems when you're running with ggplot. As the authors point out, R is indeed extremely picky. Some of you experienced this in Unit 1, just a misplaced parentheses, a forgotten comma, for example, in an argument. And in this case with ggplot, it's also very finicky about where the plus sign indicating the new layer to the chart actually goes. In this case, this is not going to run because, there we go. So as you can see, it's running the first line of code, which we've done before and got nothing, and it's not adding on this additional layer, and the reason for that is because this plus sign does need to go at the end of the line there. So now if we run it, it should be good to go. So you're going to face some common problems. Give some advice in this chapter. Also, I think in the, there we go, I think in the very beginning, in the introduction, they provide some also some advice for when you're running into trouble. And of course, you can always email me, give me a call too, and we can help you out there. So next I want to turn to facets, which is an additional layer that we can map onto our plot. And it's something that we've noticed in the text mining for our book that Julia Silge likes to use quite a bit. So for example, when we get into sentiment analysis with R, we're going to notice she uses this facets component, this facets layer, to make multiple charts for easy comparison. And we also saw her do quite a bit of this in Chapter 3 as well when she was comparing documents. In this case, for example, she was comparing the different Jane Austen books and frequency of words in those. And then also, there we go. She also used it, for example, to compare different authors there. So this facet wrap function, this layer to ggplot, is something that's pretty critical and useful. So let's actually dig into getting some practice with this. So as we can see, in the text mining for R, they use this facet wrap function to basically display multiple charts or mini charts based on a variable that we want to use for comparison. So as we can see in this case, we're going to add an additional layer onto our ggplot data that we want to plot. And also, again, we'll still be using this geometric point function for creating a scatter plot with these two continuous variables. Mapping has not changed. We saw the the size of the engine on the x-axis, the highway mileage on the y-axis. And now we're going to say, let's take a look at this data, and we are going to basically pull it out and look at separate charts for each of these individual classes, instead of in the previous example where we compared them all on the same grid, which could get a little bit messy. We're going to take a look at each of these separately. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to copy this over to R and just run this on my own just so I can get some experience. Again, I would recommend that you actually just hand type this. One thing I do want to point out that the authors point out in this book is this little tilde symbol. So this basically specifies the formula that we want to use for indicating how we want to break out these charts. And in this case, we want to take a look at, we want to create separate charts based on class. So let's go ahead and run this, and we should get something similar to what we saw in the book. And there we go, and we can actually zoom this. Excellent. And get a closer look here. So now we can see them broken out each by their own class. One thing this also tells us really quickly is we don't have very many two-seaters in our data set, not a lot of minivans, and a bulk of the cars included in this data set are SUVs, some compact cars, subcompacts, etc. So let's go ahead and close that out. So that's a quick example of what facet wrap does. We could go ahead if we wanted to and create 3 rows if we wanted to do that. Just specify this as 3, and then now we should get 3 rows of this. There we go. And also, there's no reason we couldn't, if we wanted to, just do a single row and have them all along the same. There we go. And I'm going to make this bigger so we can just quickly compare side by side. That's not especially useful or helpful. But anyways, that demonstrates this additional layer called facet wrap. And again, I wanted to call this out because this is something that we see quite a bit used pretty extensively in the text mining for our book. The main thing that I want to point out for section 6 of chapter 3 is that I keep throwing out this word layers, and that's one of the nice things that ggplot allows us to do, is to kind of build these layers upon layers for our charts. And a good example of this is what we see here at the very beginning. So in this case, this chart's going to look familiar. This is where we made a scatter plot. This one over here uses a different geometric function. Let's see if I can pull this up here. So this does some smoothing with, this does some smoothing of the data with confidence intervals shaded along the line there. And one of the nice things is we could run each of these separately and then get these two distinct charts. But he works his way, or the authors work their way into demonstrating how we can actually just create these two charts together to add them for layers. Let me just kind of illustrate here. This is going to show you a little bit better. So again, we've already seen this combination of layers right here. So we've got our data, we've got our scatter plot, we're specifying the X and Y axis. And here, we also want to add to this chart some smoothing with some confidence intervals there. So let's go ahead and run that. There we go, and we should get a replication of that. And then we can add on actually an additional layer to that as well. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, instead of saving us some time and effort, instead of rewriting the same mapping aesthetics for the X and Y axis, since we're going to be using them both for our scatter plot and also for our smoothing that we do, it's a little bit more efficient to just simply, as the authors have done here, to just include that information with our ggplot function at the very beginning, since they're effectively using the same mapping features. So let's go ahead and paste that there, and as you can see here, this is going to produce the exact same chart as what we have up above. So let's go ahead and run this. And there you can see we've replicated this chart up here. So now what we can do is, now that we have this out of the way, we can add some unique characteristics to our scatter plot, as well as some unique characteristics to our geom smooth function right there, which the authors, demonstrate over here. So if we wanted to, again, change our points on the scatter plot and color them by class, we can go ahead and add that. There we go. One thing I do want to point out is you notice that we had to completely copy over this mapping equals aesthetic again. Whereas in the past, when we did this, we just included it in the geom point function there. The reason we have to, I just want to spell this out. I think they might spell it out in the book, but that exercise that I pointed out where we had specified color as blue, and for some reason on the chart the color didn't show up as blue. The reason for that is if we are making a color dependent upon a variable that's included in the data set, we have to explicitly call out the aesthetic function here within this geom point argument. However, if we just wanted to make the color blue, irregardless of the data in the data set, we could just go ahead and specify it as blue, and then we don't have to spell out mapping or aesthetic. So we're using the aesthetic for the mapping when we have to explicitly, using information from the data set to create a color or to create a size or to create the shape of the points. So in this case here, I just want to say, let's go ahead and just color this blue because for whatever reason, let's say I want to match to a color scheme for a school or district that I'm working with for their final report. I want it to be blue. So let's go ahead and demonstrate what that looks like, and then you can see I don't have to specify mapping equals aesthetic and then put it in there. I can just call it out specifically and say, let's make the color of those points on the graph blue. So just for the sake of time, and because the text does a really nice job of walking you through the code and also providing some exercises for practice to get you thinking about how exactly these functions work and producing some on your own. I'm going to ask you that you go through the remaining chapter on your own for Lesson 1 of Unit 2, the statistical transformations, for Section 7 in the exercises, position adjustments, coordinate systems, and then finally his summary of data visualization. So let's go ahead and move on to just getting you set up with the swirl lesson. When you turn in your code for the Part 2 assignment, your practice code, just to demonstrate for me that you've worked through all of the lessons, I do recommend, it makes it a little bit easier for me. I noticed some of you have submitted individual R files for each lesson, which is perfectly fine, makes things easy for me. I also ask that you make good use of these headers for helping me just quickly read through your code and see what sections you've worked on. So for example, I'm going to create a new one now that I'm moving on to the swirl lesson for Unit 1. And then I'm going to be working on the Lesson 8, I believe it is, ggplot Part 1, ggplot Part 1. And remember, you can make little outlines in your code using either the four hashtags or the 4 dashes. Either one works. All right, so let's get started with Swirl then and get set up. So we've already installed the new course, exploring, exploratory data analysis. So let's go ahead and load that. But first we need to call up Swirl. Oops. All right, enter our name. And I don't see it there, so let's go ahead to the main menu. And there it is, exploratory data analysis, course number 2 in my little course repository for Swirl. And I'm going to go to Lesson 8, ggplot Part 1, ggplot2 Part 1, and it's going to get me into the lesson. So again, remember these little 3 dots mean just hit enter, and it's going to walk you through some information, etc., etc. There we go. One thing I want to point out, so far we have focused on the ggplot function. In ggplot2, there's 2 functions that really do the bulk of the work. There's this one that we've spent a lot of time on already called ggplot. There's also another function called qplot, quickplot. Let me take you really quickly, into the help window, and there's qplot, which stands for quickplot. And ggplot Part 1 of the swirl lesson is going to introduce you to that one, which is very similar to the plotting function just in base R. So that's going to wrap up Lesson 1 of Unit 2. Again, let's go back to, there we go. We have 2 main assignments. One is reading through, doing the practice code and the exercises for Chapter 3, and then also, I'm sorry, I need to fix that. That should say Lesson 8 and Lesson 9 of the exploratory data analysis course. One final thing I want to point out, because I noticed in Unit 1 sometimes it was getting a little wonky in terms of entering correct answers but not identifying correct answers. I've located the lesson master and the answer key for each of these lessons, so when you get stuck or if you run into questions, you can always refer to those. Just go ahead and click on those, and it's going to take you to the GitHub repository where these are located. And as you can see, this is going to include information. This is just those introductions that you saw. And then when it does provide questions for you to respond to, this, for example, is a multiple choice question. You can see here that it's going to have a list of all of the answer possibilities, and then it's going to identify the correct answer. So this is an answer key that you can use when you're working through Swirl and you may have questions and you get stuck. So have fun with ggplot. I think you're gonna. I think it's going to be hopefully a pretty good experience for you and give you a good, solid introduction to doing some basic charting and graphing in R. And I think in the long run, this is going to save us time. So when we're creating plots, just for the purposes of our analyses, we don't have to export data into program like Excel, and then whip up charts in Excel and then include those. But again, when we get to the final assignment, you're going to have the option whether for your visualizations that you include in your report, whether you want to use ggplot for your graphs or if you want to export the data because you're a little bit more comfortable using things like Excel or Tableau. So that ends lesson 1. Looking forward to seeing some of the things that you get out of this. Again, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to either post them in the forum if you think it's something that might be useful for everyone and you think someone else might be struggling with the same issues, or to email me directly as well.